Before we get into one of the most brutal sieges in human history, let me ask you something. What happens when a city built on an island in the middle of a lake, protected by causeways and canals, faces an enemy that builds warships specifically to destroy those defenses? What happens when smallpox, starvation, and psychological warfare combine with the largest native coalition ever assembled in the Americas? You're about to find out. And I promise you, this is not the sanitized version you learned in school. No noble conquistadors, no simple narrative of European superiority. Just the geography, the disease, the politics, and the sheer brutality of what happened when two worlds collided and one of them died. If you're here for real history, the kind that doesn't soften the edges, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what siege or battle I should cover next. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back to 1521, to the jewel of Mesoamerica, to a city that would be reduced to rubble and corpses in 93 days. Tenochtitlan, in 1519, was one of the largest cities on Earth. Somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people lived there, making it larger than any city in Spain, larger than Paris, comparable to Constantinople. It sat on an island in Lake Texcoco, in the Valley of Mexico, 7,000 feet above sea level. The city was built on a grid system with canals running between districts, earning it comparisons to Venice from the Spanish who first saw it. Three major causeways connected the island to the mainland, each wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast, each with removable bridge sections that could be pulled up to isolate the city in case of attack. Aqueducts brought fresh water from springs on the mainland. Chinampas, floating gardens built on reed mats anchored to the lake bed, provided food. The great temple, the Templo Mayor, rose in the center of the city, twin pyramids dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the war god, and Tlaloc, the rain god. Blood ran down those steps daily from human sacrifices, a religious practice that horrified the Spanish and provided endless justification for what they would later do. The Aztec Empire in 1519 was not a unified state in the European sense. It was a tribute empire, a network of city-states and kingdoms dominated by the Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, with Tenochtitlan as the dominant partner. The Mexica people, what we call the Aztecs, had migrated into the Valley of Mexico 2 centuries earlier as a marginal, landless group. Through warfare, strategic marriages, and sheer ruthlessness, they had built an empire that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, extracting tribute in gold, jade, cacao, feathers, cotton, and human captives for sacrifice. But it was a fragile empire. Subject peoples hated the Mexica. The tribute demands were crushing. Rival cities remembered when they had been independent. The Tlaxcalans, to the east, had never been conquered and maintained a state of perpetual war with Tenochtitlan. This resentment, this network of enemies, would be the Aztec Empire's undoing. Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with approximately 600 men, 16 horses, a few cannons, and orders from the governor of Cuba to explore and trade, not to conquer. Cortés ignored those orders immediately. He scuttled his ships to prevent his men from deserting, founded the town of Veracruz to give himself legal authority independent of Cuba, and began marching inland. He was a minor nobleman from Extremadura, educated but poor, ambitious to the point of recklessness, politically astute, and utterly pragmatic. He understood that 600 Spaniards could not conquer an empire of millions by force alone, so he didn't try, he made allies. The first major alliance was with the Totonacs, a coastal people who hated the Aztecs and had been paying tribute for decades. Cortés promised to free them from Aztec domination. He imprisoned Aztec tribute collectors, a shocking act of defiance that forced the Totonacs to commit to the Spanish or face annihilation. When the Aztecs retaliated, they committed. Next were the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who had fought the Aztecs to a stalemate for generations. The Tlaxcalans initially attacked the Spanish, testing them in a series of battles that the Spanish won through superior steel weapons, cavalry charges that terrified infantry who had never seen horses, and firearms that, while slow to reload and unreliable, had massive psychological impact. After weeks of fighting, the Tlaxcalan leadership made a calculated decision. If the Spanish were enemies of the Aztecs, they were potential allies. The Tlaxcalans joined Cortés, providing thousands of warriors, supplies, intelligence, and translators. This was the foundation of Spanish success. In November 1519, Cortés entered Tenochtitlan peacefully, invited by the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II. Montezuma's decision to allow the Spanish into the city is still debated by historians. He may have believed Cortés was connected to the god Quetzalcoatl, though this theory has been largely discredited. More likely, he was trying to assess the threat, to control the Spanish through hospitality and intimidation, to figure out what these strange foreigners wanted. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Within days, Cortés took Montezuma hostage, holding him under house arrest in his own palace. The Spanish occupied the city as guests who were actually captors. For months, this surreal situation held. Montezuma gave orders from captivity. The Spanish explored the city, marveled at its wealth, and melted down gold artifacts, and then everything exploded. In May 1520, Cortés had to leave Tenochtitlan to deal with a Spanish force sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest him for insubordination. He left Pedro de Alvarado in command with about 80 men. Alvarado was brave, violent, and catastrophically poor at political judgment. During a religious festival, Alvarado became convinced, or claimed to be convinced, that the Aztecs were planning an uprising. He ordered his men to attack the unarmed celebrants in the temple courtyard. Hundreds of Aztec nobles were massacred. The city erupted. The Mexica rose in fury, surrounding the Spanish in their quarters, cutting off food and water. Cortés returned with reinforcements and fought his way back into the city, but the situation was untenable. Montezuma, still a hostage, was brought out to calm the people. They stoned him. He died days later from his wounds, or possibly from Spanish hands. The sources conflict. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spanish attempted to escape Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness. This night is known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Aztecs discovered the retreat and attacked in overwhelming force. The causeways became killing zones. Spanish soldiers weighed down with looted gold drowned in the lake. Horses were dragged down. Cannons were abandoned. Hundreds of Spaniards died. Thousands of Tlaxcalan allies died. Cortés himself barely escaped, reportedly weeping under a tree when he reached the mainland and saw the scale of the disaster. Of the roughly 1,300 Spaniards who had entered Tenochtitlan, fewer than 500 survived. The Aztecs had won, but they hadn't destroyed the Spanish. That was the critical era. Cortés and his survivors retreated to Tlaxcala, where they were welcomed. The Tlaxcalans had suffered enormous losses, but saw the Spanish as still useful. Over the next months, Cortés rebuilt his forces. Reinforcements arrived from the Caribbean, attracted by rumors of gold. More native allies joined, sensing that the Aztecs were vulnerable, and Cortés devised a plan. He couldn't take Tenochtitlan by direct assault. The causeways could be defended too easily, but he could take it by siege. To do that, he needed to control the lake. He needed ships. Cortés ordered the construction of 13 brigantines, shallow-draft warships designed to operate on Lake Texcoco. The timber was cut in the mountains near Tlaxcala, shaped by Spanish shipwrights, carried piece by thousands of Tlaxcalan porters over 50 miles to the lake. The logistics was staggering. Each brigantine was approximately 40 feet long, carried a cannon, could be rowed or sailed, and was crewed by Spanish sailors. These ships would break the Aztec canoe fleet, cut off the city's supply lines, and allow the Spanish to assault the causeways from multiple directions simultaneously. While the ships were being built, Cortés systematically conquered or made alliances with cities around the lake, isolating Tenochtitlan politically and economically. By April 1521, Cortés had assembled a force unlike anything the Americas had ever seen. Approximately 900 Spanish soldiers, 80 horses, 17 cannons, 13 brigantines, and somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 native allies. The exact number is disputed, but the coalition included Tlaxcalans, Texcocans who had turned against the Aztecs after a succession dispute, Totonacs, Colulans, Huitzingans, and warriors from dozens of smaller towns. This was not a Spanish conquest. This was a Mesoamerican civil war with the Spanish as the catalyst and primary beneficiaries. The new Aztec emperor was Cuauhtémoc, nephew of Montezuma, 25 years old, a proven warrior who had commanded forces during La Noche Triste. He knew the Spanish were coming. He fortified the causeways, stockpiled food and weapons, destroyed bridges to create choke points, and prepared the population for a siege. He sent emissaries to other cities asking for help. Few came, some actively joined the Spanish. The Aztec tributary empire was collapsing. The siege began in late May 1521 with the launch of the brigantines. Cortés divided his forces into 3 divisions, each commanded by a Spanish captain, each supported by tens of thousands of native allies. Pedro de Alvarado took the Tacuba Causeway to the west. Cristobal de Olid took the Coyoacan Causeway to the south. Gonzalo de Sandoval took the Iztapalapa Causeway to the southeast. Cortés himself commanded the brigantines, controlling the lake. The strategy was methodical. Each division would advance along a causeway, filling in the canals and gaps as they went to prevent retreat, supported by the brigantines on the flanks. The city would be strangled, starved, and then taken street by street. The first major engagement was on the lake. The Aztecs had thousands of canoes, light and maneuverable, crewed by warriors armed with bows, atlatls, and javelins. Against Spanish brigantines with cannons and crossbows, they were outmatched. The brigantines broke through the canoe fleets, sinking and scattering them. Aztec attempts to ram or board the ships failed. Spanish artillery raked the canoes at range. Within days, the Spanish controlled the lake. Tenochtitlan was cut off from supplies, no food, no reinforcements, no escape. The causeway assaults began immediately. Each was a nightmare. The causeways were wide but exposed, with canals cutting across them at intervals where bridges had been destroyed. The Spanish and their allies would advance under constant fire from Aztec warriors in canoes, on rooftops, behind barricades. They would reach a gap, try to bridge it with debris and earth, come under concentrated attack, fall back, try again. The Aztecs fought with desperation. They knew surrender meant death or slavery. Spanish accounts describe Aztec warriors charging into pike formations, climbing over the bodies of the dead to reach the enemy. Both sides took horrific casualties. Here's what made the siege uniquely brutal. Tenochtitlan was not a castle or a fortress with walls to breach. It was a city of interconnected buildings, canals, and streets. Every house was a potential defensive position. Every canal required bridging or draining. The Aztecs would defend a street, fall back to the next intersection, defend again. They dug pits, set traps, used the canals to attack from unexpected angles. The Spanish had to destroy the city to take it. Every building they captured was leveled to prevent reoccupation and to fill in the canals. The rubble of Tenochtitlan became the foundation for advancing Spanish forces. And then there was the disease. Smallpox had arrived in the Americas with the Spanish and spread like wildfire through populations with no immunity. An epidemic had already ravaged Tenochtitlan in late 1520, killing thousands, including the previous emperor Cuitlahuac. By the time of the siege, smallpox was endemic. The disease doesn't discriminate, but it hits the malnourished and stressed harder. Defenders trapped in the city, with dwindling food supplies and contaminated water, died in horrific numbers. Spanish accounts describe streets lined with bodies, the stench unbearable, survivors too weak to bury the dead. The Aztecs couldn't field full strength because so many warriors were sick or dead. Smallpox did more damage than Spanish cannons. Food became the decisive weapon. Tenochtitlan's Chinampas produced food, but not enough to sustain the population under siege. The aqueducts were cut. The lake water was brackish, undrinkable without boiling. The Spanish brigantines intercepted any canoes trying to smuggle in supplies. By June, people were eating anything they could find. Bark, insects, leather, rats. Bodies of the dead were reportedly cannibalized, though sources are unclear and possibly exaggerated for propaganda purposes. What is certain is that starvation was systematic and intentional. Cortés knew he didn't have to storm the city if he could wait for hunger to do the work. The psychological warfare was relentless. Cortés would periodically offer terms, surrender, and lives would be spared. Cuauhtémoc refused every time. The Spanish paraded, captured Aztec nobles, tortured prisoners within sight of the walls, demonstrated their cannons and guns to emphasize the futility of resistance. The Aztecs responded with their own displays, sacrificing Spanish captives atop the temples where their comrades could see. They would cut out the hearts, throw the bodies down the steps, and parade the heads on Tezonpantli skull racks. Both sides understood that this was total war. There would be no negotiated peace. By July, the Spanish had advanced deep into the city. The fighting was now entirely urban, house to house, room to room. The Aztecs had retreated to the Tlatelolco district in the north, the last defensible area. The marketplace of Tlatelolco, one of the largest in the world, became a battlefield. The Spanish used their few remaining horses for shock charges down wide streets, but most of the fighting was infantry grinding against infantry. Spanish steel swords and armor gave them an edge in close combat, but the Aztecs had numbers, desperation, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Aztecs developed countermeasures to Spanish tactics. They dug pits covered with branches to break cavalry charges. They used long spears to keep Spanish infantry at a distance. They threw roof tiles and stones from buildings. They learned to target Spanish officers, recognizing that the native allies would often hesitate if their Spanish commanders fell. And they used the canals brilliantly, launching surprise attacks from the water, retreating before the Spanish could organize a response, then hitting another position. But nothing could overcome the strategic situation. The Aztecs were surrounded, starving, dying of disease, and running out of weapons. The Spanish were receiving reinforcements. More Spanish soldiers arrived from the Caribbean. Native allies cycled in and out, fresh warriors replacing exhausted ones. The Tlaxcalans alone may have committed over 50,000 men over the course of the siege, not all at once, but in waves. The Aztecs had no such reserves. Cortés tried one final offer of terms in early August. He sent messages to Cuauhtémoc saying that enough blood had been spilled, that the city was lost, that surrender would spare what remained of the population. Cuauhtémoc's reply, recorded in Spanish sources, was defiant. He would rather die than surrender. The Aztec nobility supported him. They knew Spanish mercy was selective at best. The final assault was ordered. On August 13, 1521, the last defenses collapsed. The Spanish and their allies stormed Tlatelolco. The fighting was apocalyptic. Aztec warriors, many too weak from starvation to hold weapons properly, fought with stones and broken obsidian. Women and children were in the streets. The canals were choked with bodies. Spanish accounts, even those written by men who participated, described the slaughter with horror. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a conquistador who wrote the most detailed Spanish chronicle, said that the smell of death was so overpowering that the Spanish had to retreat at times just to breathe. He estimated that 40,000 Aztecs died in the final assault alone. Modern historians think the total death toll over the 93-day siege was between 100,000 and 240,000 people. Most were civilians. Cuauhtémoc tried to escape by canoe with his family and remaining nobles. A Spanish brigantine intercepted him. He was captured and brought before Cortés. According to Spanish accounts, Cuauhtémoc pointed to Cortés's dagger and told him to use it, that death was preferable to captivity. Cortés did not kill him immediately. Cuauhtémoc was tortured, his feet burned to force him to reveal where the Aztec gold was hidden. He revealed nothing, either because he didn't know or because there was nothing left to reveal. He was kept alive for years as a figurehead prisoner, paraded around, and eventually executed in 1525 when Cortés became paranoid about a supposed rebellion. The aftermath of the siege was the erasure of a civilization. Tenochtitlan was systematically destroyed. The temples were torn down. The stones were used to build Mexico City, the colonial capital of New Spain. The canals were filled in. The lake itself would eventually be drained over centuries, turning the Valley of Mexico into the sprawling urban landscape it is today. Aztec religion was outlawed. Human sacrifice was ended. The gods were replaced with Catholic saints. The Nahuatl language survived but became subordinate to Spanish. The social structure was dismantled. Aztec nobility who had survived were co-opted into the Spanish colonial system or marginalized. The population of central Mexico, estimated at around 15 to 20 million before contact, would collapse to less than 2 million over the next century from disease, forced labor, and warfare. The Spanish Empire rose on those ruins. The silver mines of Mexico would fund Spanish power for 2 centuries. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish conquistadors control over native labor, created a feudal structure that persisted long after Spain lost its colonies. Cortés himself became fabulously wealthy, though he died in Spain, largely forgotten, his political enemies having outmaneuvered him. The native allies who had made the conquest possible were rewarded with relative autonomy at first, but the Spanish eventually subjugated them too. Tlaxcala retained some privileges, but by the end of the colonial period, they were as oppressed as any other indigenous group. How did 900 Spaniards and 80,000 allies destroy an empire of millions? Start with geography. Tenochtitlan's island location, its greatest defensive strength, became a trap when the Spanish controlled the lake. The causeways that protected the city also limited escape. The brigantines broke the Aztec canoe fleet and turned the siege into slow strangulation. Then disease. Smallpox killed more Aztecs than Spanish weapons. It weakened defenders, lowered morale, and made organized resistance nearly impossible. The Spanish were not immune, but they had survived childhood exposure in Europe and had partial resistance. The Aztecs had none. Next, politics. The Aztec tributary empire was hated by its subjects. When the Spanish offered an alternative, dozens of cities joined them. The Siege of Tenochtitlan was not Europeans conquering indigenous people. It was Mesoamerican city-states using European technology and leadership to settle old scores. The Tlaxcalans didn't fight for Spain. They fought to destroy their ancient enemy. The irony that they replaced one overlord with a worse one doesn't diminish their motivation at the time. Then tactics. Spanish steel armor and weapons gave them a significant edge in close combat, but not an insurmountable one. What mattered more was combined arms. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, and naval power used in coordination. The Aztecs fought with incredible bravery and tactical intelligence, but they were adapted to Mesoamerican warfare, ritualized combat focused on capturing prisoners for sacrifice. The Spanish fought total war, focused on killing, on breaking the enemy's ability and will to resist. Those are fundamentally different paradigms. And finally, leadership. Cortés was ruthless, pragmatic, and strategically brilliant. He understood that the siege would be won by logistics and morale, not just battles. He kept his coalition together through a combination of promises, shared plunder, and the understanding that all parties were committed. Cuauhtémoc was brave and defiant, but he was leading a losing position from the start. No amount of courage could overcome starvation, disease, and isolation. The long-term consequences of the siege reshaped world history. The Spanish conquest of Mexico opened the Americas to European colonization on a scale previously unimaginable. The wealth extracted from Mexico funded Spanish wars in Europe, the expansion of the Catholic Church, and the creation of a global trade network that connected Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of crops, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New, accelerated. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and chocolate went to Europe. Wheat, horses, cattle, and smallpox came to the Americas. The demographic collapse of the indigenous population created a labor shortage that was filled by the transatlantic slave trade, bringing millions of Africans to the Americas in chains. And here's the final irony. The Spanish built their empire on the ruins of the Aztecs using the exact same methods. Tribute, forced labor, and violence. They claimed to have brought civilization and Christianity to a land of savages who practiced human sacrifice. They conveniently ignored that their own inquisition was torturing and burning heretics, that their conquests were driven by greed, and that the death toll they inflicted through disease and exploitation far exceeded anything the Aztecs had done. The Aztecs sacrificed thousands. The Spanish killed millions, not through ritual, but through systemic brutality disguised as divine mission. But on August 13, 1521, on the rubble-choked streets of Tlatelolco, as the last Aztec warriors died fighting with stones because they had nothing else left, the world changed. An empire that had dominated central Mexico for a century was gone. A city that had been compared to Venice was reduced to ruins, and the Spanish Empire, built on gold and blood and the corpses of indigenous peoples, rose in its place. That's the story of the Siege of Tenochtitlan. No fluff, no romanticism, just the geography, the disease, the politics, and the brutal arithmetic of conquest. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next video. Share this with anyone who thinks they know the story of the conquistadors but has only heard the sanitized version. Drop a comment telling me what you thought, what I got wrong, what siege or battle you want covered next. This is history without the filter, the kind that respects your intelligence and doesn't pretend war is glorious. We're just getting started.